Although it is not an aggressive and weedy species, or an organism that surreptitiously thrives amongst ruin, I would like to consider the polar bear as a feral animal. This is because of its capacity to outmaneuver managerial attempts to discipline its body and impose upon it the conditions of what we might call environmental stability. The polar bear is feral because it is a reluctant subject of conservation. Take, for example, the hunting quotas imposed in Canada in 1968. They failed to stabilize polar bear populations as promised. Or the conservation reserves that protect valuable polar bear denning habitat but are useless in the face of the degradation of sea ice so crucial to polar bear survival. Otherwise, there is the uplisting of polar bear to the status of threatened species by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in 2008. It did not stimulate action on climate change as intended. It only undermined the polar bear sport hunting economy that supports many Inuit communities. I argue that these failures in the feral appearance of the bear and the thaw result from an inability to properly account for the polar bear as a co-producer of natures inhabited by both bears and humans. So, while there is a familiar story of climate change to tell about the bear, it is often a dangerous and fickle reduction. In December of 2017, the environmental media organization Sea Legacy released a video of a starving polar bear through the website of the National Geographic Society. The video is a deliberately effective tactic, designed to elicit sympathy for the bear and to generate concern about climate change. Paul Nicklin, founder of Sea Legacy and one of the filmmakers present when this footage was shot, commented that when scientists say bears are going extinct, I want people to realize what it looks like. It was later, in June of 2018, that the original statements connecting the bear to climate change were quietly walked back. The article accompanying the video posted on National Geographic now bears a note that the earlier version of the video went too far in suggesting that climate change was responsible. The retraction followed significant criticism from Inuit leaders, such as the mayor of Iqaluit, Madeleine Redfern, as well as polar bear monitor and wildlife technologist Leo Ikakik. There is also a story of the bears that resonates with Arctic inhabitants, in which the role of the victim is not played by the bear. In July of this year, a man named Aaron Gibbons was attacked and killed by a polar bear while collecting eggs with his children several kilometers from their home in Arviat and Nunavut. Relatives, who were still reeling from the attack, argued that the polar bears have been increasingly desensitized by encounters with tourists in the nearby town of Churchill. The opinion is shared among many who live across the Arctic. They suggest that the bears learn that encounters with humans need not be fatal, a dangerous lesson for many people who have to live with the bears. This latter story about the visceral and intimate entanglement of polar bears and humans reveals the fraught politics produced by bears and humans. So, citing the cultural value of bear hunting, safety concerns raised by community residents, and the political climate, in 2004, the government of Nunavut approved increases to the polar bear hunting quotas for the Baffin Bay and Western Hudson Bay subpopulations. Across the Canadian Arctic, people have been seeing more polar bears than ever before. Increases in quota are thought to be the only way to control the population and ensure public safety. I posit that there is a way of thinking about humans and polar bears without letting one or the other overdetermine how the story should be told. Anthropocene is at once a dangerous and valuable concept for thinking through the entanglement of human and polar bear natures. So, without getting mired by the pessimism, techno-utopianism, and colorblindness of many popular deployments of the term, I would like to advance a notion of the Anthropocene that is not a terminal condition, nor a relieving admission of guilt, but rather the Anthropocene is a moment to think of the inseparability of nature and society. After all, the plurality of human cultures have always occupied an Anthropocene or an environment that is largely of our own making. To elaborate on this, I turn to the work of geographer Noel Castry and his concept of social natures. In the introductory chapter to the 2001 book Social Nature, Theory, Practice, and Politics, Castry begins by emphasizing that since the 20th century, the relation between nature and society has achieved a new breadth, depth, and consequentiality. In contemporary geography, there are three main dispositions to studying this relationship. There's one, the people and environment perspective, two, a position of ecocentrism, and three, the social approach. The people and environment perspective depends profoundly on a dichotomy between humans and nature. In this approach, humans are understood as actors external to nature who act upon it. It equates nature with environmental problems and produces only technocratic knowledge amenable to the management rather than the transformation of socio-political systems that produce environmental conflict and crises. The ecocentric approach argues that, quote-unquote, we, humans, need to get back to nature and respect it. Still animated by environmental problems, ecocentrism necessitates the dismantling of contemporary systems of production and consumption to address the excesses of human civilization. Thirdly, social natures turns on the notion that nature is inescapably social. Nature is defined, delimited, and even physically reconstituted by societies. Society and nature are entangled, and their strict separation is not only ontologically impossible, but analytically unproductive. So, in order to escape the impasse of the feral bear who evades conservation, I'm working through the historical and geographic contexts of polar bear conservation using the social natures approach. By following around the intentional and unintentional consequences of polar bear management, I want to show that the knowledge produced about the nature of polar bears has been leveraged to maintain social asymmetries, while the material interactions between humans and polar bears are deeply conditioned by their accompanying sets of economic, cultural, and technical assemblages and capacities of society. So in 1909, Ernest Thompson Seton describes the polar bear as a victim of senseless slaughter. And while Seton was not a wildlife biologist himself, his testimony is certainly indicative of the attitudes held at the time by game managers and the administrators of the colonial state in the Canadian North. The imposition of the first hunting seasons were delimited in 1935, beginning in October and running until May of the following year. 3 decades later, in 1968, arbitrary quotas that were based on the previous harvest record for each community were introduced on an interim basis. The first quotas were set at half the reported harvest levels for the 1966 to 67 season for each community hunting and trapping association that had harvested polar bears. Rather than a rationally calculated scientific regulation, the initial quota setting exercise was largely guesswork, motivated by the belief that the unprecedented level of 726 bears that were killed the previous year was unacceptable, even though the population still had no reliable estimate. Euro-Canadian wildlife managers had assumed that Inuit were undisciplined hunters whose behaviors and livelihoods could and should be improved through regulation. So the quota system hardly concerned itself with bears at all. It targeted Inuit and Inuit relationships with bears as individuals and practices in need of discipline. It shouldn't be any surprise, then, that a stable population of bears remains a fugitive to this management technique. This is only part of a long history of state actors who tried to fold indigenous peoples into regional, national, and global capitalist economies. In the Arctic, Inuit were subjected to multiple rounds of relocation and settlement, which disrupted their nomadic practices and their relationship with their lands. Settlements were often created as part of attempts to enroll Inuit in extractive resource economies. However, the Canadian state's proletarianization of indigenous populations proved to be a task fraught with unanticipated difficulties. Still, the Canadian state envisaged a role for Inuit as enterprising subjects who responsibly developed industries based on fish and wildlife, with state assistance and persuasion, of course. It was clear that if this were to be the case, Inuit would no longer be permitted to hunt and fish on their own terms. Now, the polar bear hunt is habitually referred to as a conservation hunt. This applies equally to the Inuit-led subsistence hunt, as well as the Inuit-led sport hunt. The conservation hunt was necessarily an outcome of the quota and Inuit, because it could not have emerged only from Inuit understandings of the polar bear. De facto management now lies with local co-management boards, much to the chagrin of the scientific wildlife technocrats at the regional and state levels. This situation is an unintended consequence of the environmental programs undertaken by the Canadian Wildlife Service that began as far back as the 1930s. Now, conversely, the Inuit never thought of the polar bear in terms of sustainable harvests, or hunting seasons, or economic opportunities prior to the adoption of the quota. However, the Inuit now have proven to be adept at defining what is the ideal conservation hunter subjectivity. Pivoting from quota to conservation reserves, a special series called Flagship Species, Flagship Problems appeared in the Canadian Journal of Zoology in 2011. It included an article penned by a group of polar bear biologists who recommended increasing the number and extent of conservation areas to improve management of the species. The authors acknowledge the limited efficacy of a terrestrial conservation reserve, given that climate change is the major force undermining the marine habitat of the bears. Polar bears require special sea ice conditions to hunt seals, which comprise the majority of their dietary intake. Given that legislating a boundary does little to protect sea ice, it is unclear whether or not spatial conservation techniques will be effective. The article presented the rationale that, quote, protected areas could include restrictions on harvest, industrial and tourist boat traffic, icebreaking, and oil and gas development. Their list is instructive as an enumeration of acceptable nature-based activities. Their reasoning equates the polar bear hunt with other resource extraction activities, which, of course, it isn't. But more importantly, it fails to include scientific research among extractive activities in polar bear natures. Of course, it would be unimaginable to these scientists that their rules of hands-off would apply equally to them as they would to others. But these enclosures are not about cordoning off pure nature. They're about the demonstration of the state's capacity to produce nature, or at least specific aesthetics and knowledges of nature. Conservation reserves do more than just prevent development on habitat. They demarcate political boundaries and reify territorial control. Polar bear conservation reserves exert a tenuous grasp on their ecological merits. But the goal of a stable reserve of polar bear habitat is left as an unruly remainder. The reserves perform exceptionally well, however, as self-evident aesthetic geographies of nature, and they work to authorize the state as the only actor capable of securing that nature. The use of space itself as a conservation tactic in polar bear management is a relatively new thing. The province of Manitoba hosts the first conservation space dedicated explicitly to the preservation of polar bear habitat. The Churchill Wildlife Management Area was established in 1968, the same year as the first quotas, to protect polar bear habitat along the Hudson Bay coast. Years later, in 1996, Wapusk National Park wound up taking up most of the core of this area. It is the northernmost of the wildlife management areas in Manitoba, which are a set of conservation spaces with the mission of better management, sustainable development, and enhancement of the wildlife resources of the province. Clearly, the bureaucrats who crafted that phrase have done away with some of the more traditional language around habitat preservation as protective of a natural state of things. One might be inclined to believe that the government of Manitoba takes a social constructivist approach to nature from this. But in 1991, the Crown Game Preserves of Manitoba underwent a rebranding exercise to become these wildlife management areas. The game preserves were historically dedicated to the production of wildlife for the wilderness recreation pursuit of sport hunting. Now the tourism clientele has changed, but the areas are still managed for the benefit of wildlife and the enjoyment of people, and they are advertised as tourist destinations under Manitoba's Watchable Wildlife programs. Churchill touts itself as the polar bear capital of the world, and just over 500,000 people visit the region annually, mostly to see polar bears. The Churchill Wildlife Management Area matters because it is a space where stories about the polar bear in the Canadian North are produced. And through tourism, the repertoire of human polar bear entanglements that are visible in this space are rather limited. In her reflections on polar bear ecotourism in the management area, Constance Lafontaine argues that the work of conservation technicians and tourism operators emphasizes a monochromatics of place, which attempts to minimize the visibility of the very human production of this natural space. Guided polar bear tours through the Churchill Wildlife Management Area are limited to tundra vehicles that follow paths that were originally blazed by military vehicles. At the edge of the horizon looms the hollowed infrastructure of Cold War radar stations and rocket facilities, which are kept decidedly out of frames of photographs of the bears. Not far from the management area, the relocation of nuisance bears has been folded into the tourist spectacle. Bears invariably wander into the nearby town of Churchill, and are subjected to a number of deterrents that sometimes culminate in the death of the bear. As the killing of bears became more controversial, managers began detaining bears and relocating them several miles north of Churchill. The capture of nuisance animals is a messy process in which the bear's fur is inevitably colored by spray paint and bloodstains from the darting, tagging, and handling of the bears. About a decade ago, wildlife managers began sharing the aircraft launch times with tour companies who would bring their tourists in for a show. After numerous complaints from spectators who found a mottled brown, red, and green polar bear unpalatable, wildlife biologists began devoting their labor to cleaning the bear's fur before takeoff. This speaks to the ways that aesthetics are enrolled in determining which bodies, non-human and human, are worthy of conservation. In fact, the enactment of conservation as a gentle, caring exercise fits very well within the confines of an aesthetic conservation of subarctic sublime, or La Fontaine's formulation of the monochromatics of place. Once relocated, the bears from Churchill are marked with green dye and wander northward. Here we see a radio-collared bear emerge from Apusk National Park onto the sea ice and wander around, almost up to Rankin Inlet, and down the coast back past Arviat, where green-dyed bears have been seen with increasing frequency in recent years. So the Churchill Wildlife Management Area and its related practices of wildlife conservation and tourism development are not about the preservation of space as much as they are about the production of new socio-natural conditions. If the social nature narratives of human polar bear entanglement on offer in the management area are limited to the kind of shallow voyeurism that turns the bear into a Rorschach test for human guilt, we are missing out on a big part of the story. If we were serious about creating a conservation reserve that protects essential polar bear habitat, we should perhaps consider placing a wildlife sanctuary around an oil refinery and prohibiting human development there. Maybe, of course, we could allow some ecotours to operate in the area. But I think it's important to remind ourselves of the evidences of human incursion in conservation spaces. And they're an opportunity to think through the technologies and ideologies that produce the material conditions of the Anthropocene. Rather than using the polar bear as an object with which to communicate the tragedy of climate change, contextualizing the bear within Cape Churchill, amongst the ruins, and in the Thaw, complicates the encounter, exposing wildlife management in the Anthropocene as a set of processes enmeshed in systems of colonialism and imperialism. These contextualizations and complications would make it easier to see that the impulses driving conservation strategies such as reserves are a severing and narrowing of human relations with polar bears and natures. So how can we think with and live with the bear in ways that do not reproduce a feral and elusive monster of conservation? One way, perhaps, is to stop thinking of the polar bear as a being that can be expertly controlled through wildlife management. I think that the people who actively co-produce natures and societies with the bear have some advice to offer. In what we might call the Inuanthropocene, the polar bear is a sentient and active participant in multi-species social relationships. Inuit hunters attempt to maintain or improve social relationships between humans and animals through appropriate behavior before, during, and after the hunt. This may include not thinking about the bear or not actively wanting to see the bear, and this is regardless of the success of a hunt. As the former president of the Inuit Tapirut Kanatami, Terry Outla, says, climate change is an experienced reality, shared and known firsthand by Inuit and Arctic animals alike.